Hello and welcome. My name is Lisa Upton. I'm the Senior Communications Advisor with the Climate Council. And this evening I'm joined by investigative journalist and author Marian Wilkinson, journalist and author David Marr, and the Climate Council's CEO Amanda McKenzie. I want to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of this land, and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I extend this respect to the traditional owners of the land from where you are joining us. This evening, we're talking about Marian's new book, The Carbon Club. At the bottom of your window, you will see a Q&A icon. You can click there and type a question. My fabulous colleagues, Alex and Bree, behind the scenes will be filtering them through to me to ask a little bit later. Marian, let me start with you. What is the Carbon Club and why did you want to write a book about it?
Well, the Carbon Club is the name that I've given to this network of politicians, business leaders, and climate skeptics that have really played this key role over the last 2 decades in Australia. They have essentially fought to block every key initiative on climate change. And I wanted to write the book because I wanted to know why that had happened, how that had happened, and what was the motivation of these people who were involved, and to sit down really and talk to as many of them as I could, as well as those who were on the other side of this.
David, there are a lot of books being written about climate change. How important is Marian's examination of the Carbon Club?
This is a wonderful book. Marian and I were trained a long time ago in the business of writing narratives. And what this book is the story of this club and how it operates, particularly how it operates in Australian politics, often so disguised, often invisibly but powerfully. And what Marian has done is to make sense of so much of what we tend to see as isolated outrages. And she has put together the story of how these people operate, which makes it a gripping book to read. An infuriating book to read, and often actually very funny, but it's the story. That's its power. It's the story.
Amanda, you've been working hard on climate change for more than a decade, first with the Climate Commission and now with the Climate Council. When did you realise the power of the Carbon Club and what you were up against in trying to get the federal government to act on climate change?
It was probably even earlier than that, actually, when I'd started the Australian Youth Climate Coalition. So I was about 22 or 23, starting this youth organisation, mobilising young people on climate change. And at one of the first United Nations conferences that we attended with other young people from around the world, there were a number of articles written about us, calling us Hitler Youth and calling us watermelons. So green on the outside, red on the inside. So there's contrasting ideologies they thought we might come from. But the level of criticism and even death threats in those early years, when we were just sort of a fledgling new organisation of young people trying to have a say on this matter, made me realise just how vicious and extensive the network of opposition was, that it would even seek out those sort of young new activists seeking to work in this space in such a way. It made me appreciate how much of a David versus Goliath battle. I remember the early days of getting involved in climate change in sort of 2005, thinking if only people knew the facts, surely we would act. And then seeing the massive disinformation campaigns that have been so powerful since.
Marian, throughout the book, you paint a very clear picture of that and of how climate deniers in the United States have had a very significant influence on Australian politics. How did this happen?
Well, the thing that did fascinate me throughout this whole research exercise for the book was just how important discrediting the climate science was. And I mean, in some cases, a number of the people I interviewed clearly did sincerely question the science, and I don't doubt their sincerity, but they also absolutely understood that they needed a powerful political campaign to undermine the science. And one of the most interesting interviews, I think, in the book is one I did with one of the leading American climate skeptics, who very early on, back in the days when the Kyoto Protocol was up for ratification, he said he understood that if they didn't question the climate science, then the moral imperative to act on climate change would be with the people demanding action. And so it came down to that question that is now so prevalent today. You know, why didn't you act on climate change? What are you going to tell your children? What are you going to tell your grandchildren? Well, this answered that question. If you undermine the science, if you undermine the urgency of the science, if you question that, you took away that moral imperative to act. And I think that was so important, both in the US and here. And you can see over a period of something like 2 decades, the pursuit of that message in America and in Australia was really so important to the people who were involved. And the way they sold that message was shared, obviously, between the leading proponents of that view here and in the US.
David, what's your view on how the American climate deniers have influenced the climate debate in Australia?
Well, one of the small ways, but important ways that they've done this is by massaging the language. The moral imperative to act is, of course, diminished in the public eyes if you ridicule those who are calling for action. And that's what Amanda was talking about, threats and ridicule. And so they're called hotheads and they're called fools and they're Nazis, etc., etc., etc. But always there has to be an attack on the sincerity of the motive of those people who are calling for change, either because there's no science to support their calls or because they are just not being honest with the public. And so words like correct, which is an unambiguously good word, becomes political correctness. And therefore, there's a sense that people are not speaking the truth. Virtue, an unequivocally good word, becomes virtue signalling. And in these ways, and they're not small ways, they're significant achievements to be able to pervert language in this way. You can undermine argument. It is all about undermining argument. And they're terribly, terribly good at it. The same minds that work out how to sell baked beans are working out how to discredit scientific and popular argument on climate change. They are geniuses at it.
Amanda, as climate communicators, of course, we're aware of this negative influence that Marian and David have both just described, this manipulation of language, questioning of the science. What are your recommendations for countering this?
Well, it was interesting reading Marian's book. Some of it did make me feel really angry and frustrated on reflection, remembering going through that time. And one of the times it was kind of rock bottom, which we'll probably talk about more, is sort of around 2011 to 2013, when the carbon tax debate was going on. It coincided with a La Nina period where there was more rainfall, which was right after a period of drought. And so we had some extreme storms and some extreme rainfall and flooding, which allowed the deniers to go into another spate of a push saying, it's raining, what were these climate scientists talking about? They said it was drought. And there'd been so much work to show that the drought was influenced by climate change that people had effectively made them one and the same. So that sort of discrediting of people and argument was really, probably the worst time for that was then. The Climate Council was started around that time, and one of our key objectives was around the communications. It was clear that we needed to fix this, and communications is a long game. It takes time to change a narrative, particularly if you don't have huge advertising budgets, if you're just using the free press, which obviously some of the free press has very strong opinions on this and usually not positive in our perspective. So we knew that we had to make extreme weather one of the key elements of the story, and it had to be about making it local and tangible and showing that it's with us today. It couldn't be about polar bears and the globe and things that are quite foreign to Australians. It needed to be about stuff happening now on our doorstep. So we did a lot of work in contextualising every different extreme weather event that happened in describing the climate influence. But it's not enough just to do that and present the facts. It's also about who tells the story. So a lot of our work has been diversifying the messengers because, as David said, so many of the messengers just get attacked relentlessly for anyone that puts their head above the parapet, which it makes it difficult to encourage others to come out. So we've done lots of work with farmers, firefighters, doctors, solar installers, people on both the front lines of the consequences as well as those that can benefit from the solutions, in trying to repopulate the conversation. And that's allowed us to get into a much broader range of publications where it's not perceived as ideological on climate if you've got a farmer talking about it. So you're more likely to get in the Land and in the Australian, etc. So it's both been about what is the story and how to tell it, as well as who is the storytellers, and making sure that there's that credibility in those people and that you're consistently bringing more people to the conversation.
Marian, one of the things I found most striking reading your book is how many of the skeptics who were hard at work trying to prevent action on climate change decades ago, how many of them who were willing to talk to you for this book, and they're clearly proud, even now, about all the work they've done to derail action on climate change, Tony Abbott chief among them. Did that strike you as quite incredible?
Not at all, because essentially they still believe they're right. They really saw themselves as defending Australia's wealth. And in their eyes, Australia's wealth, that's the wealth of our industry, exports, jobs, etc., was absolutely rooted in the fossil fuel industry and the industries that they could help fuel. And so, no, to the contrary, they were still very proud of their role. One of the few times I was talking to someone from the Institute of Public Affairs down in Melbourne. In the end, we couldn't use the conversation, but it was in a very difficult time for them because the Victorian Liberal Party had just lost the election that they thought they were going to win against Dan Andrews. And a couple of them were really quite depressed. And we started talking about whether climate change had had an influence on the election, which they thought it had. And they were asking themselves whether climate change was the Brexit issue for the Australian Liberal Party. It was not long after Malcolm Turnbull's demise and the Federal Party had ripped itself to pieces yet again. And I thought for the first time I saw a glimmer of doubt about the strategy. But I think we have to remember that behind that thinking is something kind of very economically and legally important. If you do accept what people like the IPCC are saying, and that we have a limited amount of time to change, and the science is telling us these are what our options are, and as a business or a politician, but a politician who supports a business to keep on flying in the face of that evidence, inevitably you are going to come up against both legal and financial problems in a big way. And I think this is what obviously is affecting a lot of CEOs at the moment in Australia. So it's not just an ideological thing. There are really serious legal and economic consequences for the firms who have in the past supported the Carbon Club.
One of the chief supporters of the Carbon Club, of course, was Tony Abbott, who you spent a bit of time with, David, before he became Prime Minister in 2013. He was very effective, wasn't he, at derailing action on climate?
He is terrific at cutting through. His capacity to find formulae that are going to work in public debate is first class. There's no doubt about it. And the trick, at least until he came into government and showed that it was indeed only a trick, his trick was to be able to sound deeply principled about what he was saying, that this came from within himself as a deep principle. And this is horseshit, of course, with Abbott. I mean, that's the thing about the man. He's a great debater. He's great with words. And he knows to the tips of his fingers how to exercise the politics of destruction. And he set about destroying the carbon tax. He did it extremely ruthlessly, and it brought him ultimately to power. But once in power, I mean, he got rid of the tax and he did a number of other things, but then there was the bewilderment. As he said to me one day, what if I'm like the dog that catches the car and then doesn't know what to do? And that's in fact what he turned out to be as a prime minister. But great on the appearance of principle, great in finding formulae to cut through in the debate. And he came to a decision. Remember, under Howard, he was one of the people who was advocating a price on carbon. He was one of the people that moved Howard into that direction. He had a different view. This was his pathway to power, and he exercised it. And I think one of the things that we need to be very clear about here, and what Amanda was saying about securing public opinion is crucial. And public opinion, of course, as we know, is strongly and has been for a long time, strongly for action on climate change. It is not uncertainties in the public mind that is stopping action. What's stopping action is within the government and the opposition parties. That's where the problem lies. And that's because this is an argument not about science, not about public opinion, but it is an argument with the influence of money inside the Australian political system and how extraordinarily lax we are about controlling money in our democracy.
Amanda, as Marian writes about in her book, the first act of the Abbott government was to abolish the Climate Commission, where you had a senior role. Explain what the commission did, why it was abolished, and how that led to the birth of the Climate Council.
So the commission was set up under Gillard with a range of different climate pieces of the puzzle, and the job of the Climate Commission was to engage a range of experts and have them travel around Australia explaining the science and the economics around climate change. It was an independent body, and it was tasked in a very politically hot environment in doing that public education work. So I was a senior communications advisor there, and about half of our current councillors were commissioners at that time. Abbott had made an election promise that he would abolish the commission, as well as dismantling the rest of basically every other climate policy and institution. And it turned out that it was the first act of the Abbott government. We didn't know when it would happen or how it would happen. And it was actually kind of fortuitous that it was done in such a public way so quickly, because the intent from us was, well, we think the work we're doing is really important. And we're also, having seen what happened in Canada, for instance, under Harper, we're concerned that scientists that are employed by the government, and this then happened, as is noted in the book, will be then pulled back from what they're able to say. And we saw this from the Bureau, we saw it from other scientists that were receiving government grants, that they felt that they couldn't speak out as vocally once the Abbott government was in power. So we thought it was going to be really important that the commission's work continued. So we went out on a limb a few days after we'd been abolished, and said to the public, will you get behind us? And I'm sure some of the people watching were founding friends at the time, and we were very fortunate that the public got behind us. 15,000 people put their hand in the pocket in that 10-day period, and it was the biggest crowdfunder in Australia's history to raise $1.3 million to put us back in business. And we're now, I suppose we're in our 7th year now. And Leslie Hughes always likes to say how long we outlasted the Abbott government as a
Marian, tell us about the US President Barack Obama's trip to Australia for the G20 summit in Brisbane and how he went off script to criticise Tony Abbott over climate change.
This was one of the very interesting conversations I had when I was in Washington researching the book. I spoke to John Podesta, who was at the time, in Obama's time, he had been brought into the White House. He was a real political operator. He'd been Bill Clinton's chief of staff. He was brought into the White House in Obama's second term to move along the climate change issue that had thwarted the administration in Obama's first term. And the big thing was that Obama, of course, had been really humiliated in Copenhagen by the Chinese, and they were determined this was not going to happen again. So there was a huge amount of work put in to get an initial deal with the Chinese President Xi Jinping prior to the Paris conference, and everyone had their eyes set on the Paris conference. So according to Podesta, the Obama White House wanted to do this sort of 1-2 punch. They wanted to do the big announcement in Beijing. Then they were all flying to Australia for the G20. And there, you know, the Obama administration wanted climate change on the agenda there, and they wanted to unveil their proposal for this big green investment fund, clean energy investment fund, in order, obviously, to try and bring some of the other developing countries on board for Paris. Anyway, what happened was that they were being thwarted, essentially, from Canberra. And so Podesta was already really annoyed before he left Washington for Beijing. And he'd let fly at a meeting there. And he told me that the way he saw it was that Abbott was the Donald Trump of our times, that, as he put it, he was really rowing in the opposite direction of what they really needed to do at the G20. Anyway, this wrangle went on, and eventually, of course, what happened was that Abbott had to concede and let climate change be on the agenda. But it had been a very sort of difficult process for them. And so when Obama went to give his big speech at the University of Queensland, his national security advisor, Deputy National Security Advisor Ben Rhodes told me that climate change was only actually going to be a small part of that speech, but partly because of the Beijing deal, but partly because of his pure frustration with Abbott, Obama then started ad-libbing in his speech to put in more stuff about climate change and the barrier reef and absolutely go for it. And when I spoke to Abbott's advisors about the speech, they just said, we saw it as Obama's way to have a smash at us. And as Julie Bishop said, she was told by Abbott to get out there and push back, give the message on the barrier reef. But it was so interesting because that speech of Obama's, of course, resonated around Australia. And in some ways, it was thanks to Tony Abbott.
Amanda, what's your memory of that time more generally? That was, early days of the Climate Council.
It was a hard time. I mentioned it was sort of rock bottom for climate advocates at that time. It had been a 2-year La Nina of all of this rain, and so there'd firstly been the disaster at Copenhagen, and literally every activist around the world took the summer and northern winter off, while the deniers went nuts, putting forward a denial case, attacking the IPCC in particular. So that's sort of the start of 2010. And it sort of rolled on from there of 2 years of rain that we had to keep arguing, actually this is climate change as well. Then you had the carbon tax, which was attacked so heavily by Abbott. And then you had the election of Abbott on a climate denial platform. And he started taking apart all of the climate legislation. So for those who'd worked on the issue, it was pretty dire at that point. And the arguments that he outlined very clearly in attacking all of that climate legislation are still the arguments that have a level of potency today. But we've gradually sort of undermined them significantly and advanced our own arguments. It's arguing it's not happening. Well, if it is happening, it's not a big deal. If it is happening and it is a big deal, there's nothing we can do about it. If we were to do something about it, it'd destroy the economy. If we were to do something about it, it would be damaging to Australia, and we only have a really minor role to play anyway. So that sort of textbook of what is the denial case has been very clear now for many years. I think though, when you look back at how strong though that case was at that time, it's sort of refreshing to see how far we've come. And I think that was the useful thing for me in reflecting on Marian's book, just the level of toxicity in the debate then, and thinking back to the strategies at the Climate Council, but also lots of other advocates around the country in saying there's a number of things we've got to do. We've got to make sure everyone knows that this is happening, that it's all around us. We need to make it contemporary. We need to make it something that people can see and feel in their day-to-day life. It's, like, as I said earlier, not about polar bears, it's about people. We need to show it is a really big deal for Australia, that there's things that we can do about it. And when we're acting and employing those solutions, that they're actually good for our economy, that they create jobs, and that Australia, in making a difference, is protecting our own national interests. And so I think, as David said earlier, the case in the public is one, and increasingly it's one across business and industry. The Carbon Club, though, still remains very powerful.
David, as Marian explains in the book, one person, and I don't want to talk about Tony Abbott for much longer, but one person who stood shoulder to shoulder with him was the Catholic Cardinal George Pell. He even travelled to London to address Britain's top climate skeptic think tank, where he claimed that global warming had stopped. You've written extensively about George Pell. What was this all about?
Well, to understand why George Pell is so passionately defended by, for instance, the Murdoch press and by a number of conservatives who have no stake in religion whatever, you do have to understand that he is a coal warrior. It's another one of the things he has been. And at one stage, I mean, years ago now, he said that, you know, one of his tasks was to stop people clambering on to the coal bandwagon, the climate change bandwagon. And this kind of resonant language and the language of doubt. He was a big man in the church in a pink frock talking doubt. Now, the church is not behind him there. The church is very, very divided on this subject. And only the other day, the Catholic Archbishop of Brisbane, Mark Coleridge, again intervened in the climate debate and again called on the government for more action. So Pell was expressing a political view within the church that was very important outside the church. And there's this curious combination, a curious alliance of coal and Christ in so many of the people who oppose action on climate change. It's true of Abbott, it's true of Minchin to some extent, true of Pell, true of many of these people of faith. And let's face it, religion doesn't have a red hot record when it comes to supporting science. Can I put it no higher than that for the moment? But there are these figures, they're very important in the debate, the religious figures. They bring a particular prestige and weight to the skeptic cause, but they're also on the other side.
Marian, you write about the former Liberal insider Guy Pearce, who spent years analysing how the fossil fuel lobby's influence permeated the coalition government. He said they all shared a quarry vision. Can you tell us what that means and to what extent you think that still exists?
Yes, and I think Guy Pearce's book really did get this long before anyone else. The quarry vision was that absolute belief I was talking about, that the wealth, prosperity and power comes from the fossil fuel industry and the industries they support, whether it's aluminium, steel making, fertilizers, etc., etc. And that is deeply, deeply embedded in both the major parties. I think the what I did find interesting about this is that the hierarchy of both parties would go between either the issue of debating the science, contesting the science, or even in the Labor Party case, debating the issue around the economic losses for Australia if we go down the path too quickly of doing things about climate change. There is a real truth there. You know, we do have to have a just transition. This is absolutely important, that we bring these communities along to a cleaner economy. Otherwise, you're going to have massive social division, particularly in the regions. But what I always found interesting was that the senior business leaders, going back over their speeches, going back over some of the minutes of their internal meetings with people like Howard and the senior bureaucrats, they could not understand that something like renewable energy could ultimately play a really important role in Australia's future. It wasn't just the fact that they were in the fossil fuel industry themselves or in industries that hung off it. They really, really could not imagine it. And when you think back, it was only, I think, 6 years ago now when Tony Abbott made his famous speech that coal is good for humanity. It was only 2 years ago in the Coalition Party room we were hearing that the federal government had to subsidise a new coal-fired power plant in Australia. There is a real lack of vision amongst a whole group of people in both sides of politics and certainly in business that they can't envisage a clean energy country, a clean energy economy. But I think that view is really changing, and you only have to look now at the splits within something like the Business Council of Australia, which is ultimately pushed the Business Council board to endorse things like a 2050 carbon neutral target. So that's why I say I think the power of the Carbon Club is breaking down. But that old mentality that Guy talked about is really still there, I think. And I think it's still there in people like Rupert Murdoch and Lachlan Murdoch, as well as, of course, a whole number of politicians and business leaders as well.
Mm. Amanda, Marian ends the book looking at where we're at right now, and what we've seen in recent months, of course, is this big pivot with the Carbon Club from coal to gas, and the federal government pushing for a gas-led economic recovery from the coronavirus. Can you explain what's going on?
Yeah, it's interesting, as Marian says, it wasn't very long ago that the federal government was vocally advocating for new coal-fired generators and also getting very annoyed at AGL for saying that they would close Liddell in New South Wales. Coal, although there's some obviously very strong remaining advocates like Matt Canavan, has gone off the agenda to a large degree, and gas has moved on in its place. And it's the same arguments around coal but moved for gas. So it's all about the reliability of the grid, and you need fossil fuel power, so you have that stability. All of which have now been disproven. What the energy experts tell me is that you need some gas in the transition that is already there, but you don't need any additional gas. And that's just during the time in which you're building new infrastructure, batteries, for instance, which can come on very quickly, but they're short-term power. And then you've got larger, say, pumped hydro storage, that's that sort of slower drip. Feed storage power. But the idea that, what do we do when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine is such an old argument that hasn't kept up with the technology at all. But the gas-led recovery is certainly something that's being pushed very hard. The gas lobby is very entwined with both sides of politics and has been having a big influence through the COVID Commission, obviously, as well.
Marian, I'm heartened to hear you say a moment ago that you think the Carbon Club is starting to break up, but I'm also surprised about your optimism given what we're seeing with this gas push. How deep is this push for gas, do you think? And how likely, for example, how likely is it that we'll see the Narrabri gas project approved, for example?
Well, Narrabri, I think, is going to be a real signal to everyone about which direction we're going in here. For people who don't know, the Narrabri gas project has been one of the most contested in New South Wales. There's been a huge inquiry into this. There's been thousands of submissions about it. The other day, I don't know if you noticed, the New South Wales Environment Minister, Matt Keane, was giving a very powerful speech at the Herald Sustainability meeting conference, talking about all the new renewable energy projects he's looking at in New South Wales and new hydrogen. Yeah. At the same time, the National Party leader, John Barilaro, was up in Narrabri telling the farmers the state government would look at helping insure them against losses of damage from the gas project if only they would come in behind the Narrabri gas project. That said to me that there is still strong support within the coalition for that project, and certainly federally we know that there is big support for Narrabri. I think the interesting thing is what the investors are thinking here, because sooner or later, the investors are going to be saying, the International Energy Agency is saying we've got something like 10 years for gas investments, and then things are going to start looking really difficult. You know, it's a big bet now to go into a big new gas project. But I think that's why there's such a push on about it, because this is a sort of defining moment. And I know we're all rightly obsessed with COVID and the economy and the recession that we're in at the moment. But I personally think that this debate about what is going to happen over gas is absolutely fundamental, and it's going to be played out in the next year or so in Australia.
David, you touched on this earlier. You're talking about Australians saying that they want action on climate change. It's very clear the majority of Australians want this, and yet the Carbon Club has not allowed this to happen. How is it that these vested interests prevent politics from delivering outcomes that the Australian people want?
There's just been published a very good book on this subject by Marian Wilkinson called The Carbon Club. and she shows how it has been done. There is a tendency to look back on the logjam of the last 7-8 years in Australian politics and see it as some kind of failing of the political system. From the point of view of the Carbon Club, this has been a magnificent achievement, a political achievement of great skill that you can actually stop in its tracks. A project the Australian people want, which is demonstrably sensible and which has the backing of most sensible nations in the world. But here it's been stopped, and it's pretty good as a political achievement, just looked at technically. One of the elements of this is that the Carbon Club representatives inside political parties are willing to pull down the house if they don't get their way. This is quite unlike those people within the political systems, the lawmakers, as we call them these days, apparently not MPs anymore, but the lawmakers on the side of sensible action to combat global warming are not of the same temperament. They are not willing to pull down the house in order to get action. But the people who are wishing to prevent it are. Barilaro is currently threatening to pull the majority out from under Gladys Berejiklian in order that farmers have an unlimited right to clear koala habitat. This is koalas, ladies and gentlemen, against farmers who want to clear land. On the other hand, with climate change, with global warming, we are dealing with the owners of the greatest seam of coal in the world that runs from Cape York all the way down the east coast of Australia to the outer suburbs of Melbourne. The task in Australia is huge, and the people defending that money, as I say, are willing to destroy their own governments if they don't get their way.
We have quite a lot of audience questions, and we don't have very much time, so I'm going to go to a few of those. Amanda, one for you. What can we as citizens do to be most effective in dismantling the Climate Club, apart from voting?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think when I look back through Marian's book over the last 20 years, one of the things that Marian's focused on, obviously, is talking about the politicians and the political dynamic. But the other stream of information that you could explore as a separate book would be the growth of the political movement for action on climate change, which was absolutely in its infancy in that sort of first decade of this century, but has grown and grown in the last 10 years. So I think back to that sort of rock bottom period in sort of 2011, 2012, when there was most of the organisations working on climate were environmental organisations. Now there's the emergency leaders for climate action, there's farmers for climate action, there's vets for climate action, there's veterinary chief officers for climate action, there's parents for climate action. It's just proliferating the amount of groups that are involved in the advocacy project. And the money that is now supporting organisations has grown too. It's still a drop in the ocean compared to the billions that are even given in subsidies to fossil fuels in Australia. The whole of the climate movement generates about $50 million a year to support every organisation out there working on climate change and every person's salary, whereas you've got billions of dollars just going into subsidies, let alone those companies' profits, etc. So that sort of David and Goliath story is very clear. And I think for people wanting to make a difference, there's a few options. One is to get involved in supporting organisations financially, so donating to organisations like us or others. There's a piece of volunteering for organisations that do those active public campaigns like Australian Conservation Foundation, the Australian Youth Climate Coalition, for instance. And then there's the using your voice piece, which is writing to the newspapers, writing to your politicians. I think that writing to your newspapers and the ABC is really underestimated as a piece of work to do. The Deniers have a great traction in mobilising their people to be constantly complaining to the ABC and constantly complaining to the SMH, etc. So I think it's really important that we have our people who are concerned and want action to be writing as well.
There are quite a lot of questions that are coming in on gas. Marian, I'll go to you for this one, and then I'm sure, Amanda, you probably want to comment on this as well, but it's what we've been talking about. Isabella says, now the Australian government is spruiking gas as a transition fuel and as a key to Australia's economic recovery, but the Australian public doesn't know how dangerous gas is. How can we change this? What do you think about that, Marian?
Well, I think that this comes back to the fact that you don't have really a leadership in this country that is articulating an alternative vision on this. Gas, yes, it is important as a transition fuel, but that time for it to be a transition fuel is running out. And I think here in Australia, we don't appreciate the fact that our political leaders say, yes, we know that we've got to do something about climate change, but look, we can keep going. We can just keep going for a bit longer and, get our gas out, get our new gas fields developed, get our new LNG exports out there and make as much money as we can, essentially, while we've still got time. What happens if you've got you know, the Turkish government, who's just discovered their massive new gas fields, you know, they want to go ahead. The impoverished East Timorese, they want their gas fields to go ahead. The PNG government want their gas fields to go ahead. And sooner or later, you have to ask that question. We have a limited amount left in the carbon budget, and that means a limited amount of emissions that can go into the atmosphere if we do want to avoid climate change, dangerous climate change. And we know this is what the scientists are telling us. Well, the view that so many of, I think, our political leadership has in this country is that we can defeat the science. This is not going to happen. And I think what we need to do is have a serious debate in this country around that. And that debate, as I said before, has to take into account what happens to the regional communities. You can't just say, we're going to shut these down. You can't say we have a vague idea for renewable energy plants. I think Ross Garnaut has done some terrific work on this, but we actually need more work to say this is what the vision looks like, and this is the limited timetable we have as a country to keep producing fossil fuel industries that release this amount of emissions. And we've got to have that as a serious discussion, and we have to have it at the centre of government, not on the sidelines.
Amanda, there's a question from Tully which really goes to lots of what the Climate Council does. Tully's asking, at a local level, do you think we have more of a chance of bringing about change by lobbying local government? And I'll just get you to answer that pretty quickly because we're almost out of time.
Yeah, sure. So we took a bit of a pivot a few years ago to do less federally and more at state and local level. So we've got a program called the Cities Power Partnership that works with local government right around Australia. It's over 130 local governments are now a part of that, which represents over half of the Australian population. And there is a lot that can get done at a local government level. And a lot of the leadership that's come from local governments has then been adopted at a state level, for instance. We're then also doing advocacy work at the state government level. The states are way heads and shoulders above the federal government on this. And it's true of the coalition leaders in state energy ministers as much as it is the Labor states as well. Matt Keane has been mentioned already. He's been a real leader. The South Australian Energy Minister, Dan Van Holst-Pekin, has been a great leader as well. The Tasmanian government. There's a lot that's happening at a state government level. There needs to be more, but that progress is underway. So I think that the push at a state government level is really important. And that's where emissions have gone down in the economy, has been the electricity sector, and that's been from state government action.
Mm. And David, I do have one more question for you. You've never been afraid of taking on the big issues. When are you going to step up like Marian has done and actually start writing a bit more about climate change?
Why do I need to when we have Marian Wilkinson? This book has swept the field. There really is no need for anybody to be writing about climate change for the next few years, I suspect, because we can leave it to Marian. I have known and worked with Marian now for 30 or 40 years, and I have consistently, in that time, left issues of great weight to Marian to get on with the little things that occupy my curiosity. She's the one that will really affect the outcomes in this troubled country.
I must say, Amanda and I were talking about the book this afternoon, and one of the things that you did comment on, Amanda, is reflecting on how far we've come in 20 years. You sort of mentioned David and Goliath at the beginning, but it doesn't feel quite like that. It feels like we really have come quite a long way in 20 years, in some respects.
Yeah, I think that to work on climate change or to be engaged in the topic is to be perpetually frustrated, particularly as we're seeing the impacts so viscerally. The last summer was shocking for all Australians, I think, in the scale of the fires. But in terms of the social change and behaviour change project, these things don't happen quickly. And in 20 years, we've gone from having very little awareness of the issue to then that big awareness piece through sort of 2005 to 2010, when most Australians became aware of the issue, to then this very vexed political debate, and the Carbon Club, as Marian's articulated, having a big role in that. But at the same time, the global economics around renewable energy has fundamentally changed the game. When I started working on this issue, we were primarily arguing the moral case for action, and we were talking about hypothetical futures. Now we're firmly in that future of climate change impacts, and it's not just a moral case. We also have the economics on our side. And one of those arguments that Tony Abbott always made was, you know, it costs too much to act, it's too hard. Well, now it would be crazy not to act just from an economic standpoint, because those are the industries that are booming and have great opportunities in terms of economic recovery.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. Look, I feel like that last question has to go to Marian. And Marian, it comes from Tony. You did touch on it earlier, but Tony's question is, are any of the Carbon Club starting to think they may be on the wrong side of history?
I think so, actually. I think some are, and I think you only have to look at last year. I think it was last year, just last year, or late 2018, when you started seeing splits not only on the Business Council of Australia, but in the Minerals Council of Australia too. And I think that there is a lot of rethinking going on, but I think there is also that issue that I think Amanda raised earlier, certainly David did, that there is a big interest involved here, and not just at the business level. That's certainly an important one, but also big issues of jobs and communities as well. But, you know, this is not an easy issue. It's an issue that broke the careers of 3 prime ministers in this country. It's not for the faint-hearted. But I do think, on a lighter note, if we could get David out talking about this, I'll stick to the writing. I'm sure he'd influence quite a lot of people.
David, I think you need to step up. It's pretty clear.
I think there's some subtle abuse going on here. I've written about climate change. I've been on the backs of these politicians and churchmen. But this is a wonderful book. Let me say, this is a really wonderful book. And the sense of knowing what's going on you get from reading it. I wouldn't want to get in Marian's way at the moment.
Well, thanks to all of you for joining this evening, for joining us this evening. Congratulations on your book, Marian, and also thank you very much to our community of generous regular givers. The Climate Council is an independent, community-funded organisation, and we wouldn't be able to do this without you. Have a good evening.